Hello there, welcome to Cool Talk. In our last video, we discussed the Industrial Revolution, the changes that came with it, inventions, better means of production, a different economy. But today, we'll touch on the problems that it brought. Now, poor people have been around for millenniums, and for the most part, nobody wanted to upset the status quo. But now it was different. After the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, common folk were more willing to destroy an old system and replace it. Back then, it was an economy of scarcity. But after the Industrial Revolution, now we had an economy of plenty. But many felt that the plenty was being kept at the top. The agrarian economy was being pushed aside by factory towns and industry. Peasants were not suited for this. It was too much and too fast. But the bigger issue was that now the nations were feeling prosperity, but the peasants were feeling worse off. There was a bigger abundance of everything, but there was an ever-increasing wealth gap. Many protested, and some even wanted revolution. These were scary times. Let's begin. In Europe, in the year 1800, no city had 1 million inhabitants. But by 1900, 5 of them did. And London alone had 6.5 million. Now, what did this mean? It means you had to build houses fast. And because legislators put taxes on windows and bricks and tiles, the discouraged construction workers were not providing a lot of light and air in order to save money. And it also hampered drains and sewers. The streets were unpaved. Lighting was poor. There wasn't enough water, and it was very, very unsafe. London did not even have a police force until 1829. In 1838, the city of Birmingham, England, with 170,000 residents, didn't have garbage collectors. What did they use? They used pigs as scavengers. Tuberculosis and typhoid fever kicked in. Inadequate housing codes. Buildings were built back to back, side to side. It was damp, it was cold, it was crowded. And everybody worked, including children. In 1835, 1/3 of all factory workers were under the age of 14. Many were orphans with nowhere to go. Mothers often left their children unattended at home or took them to the factories. Now, a workday was 12 to 15 hours long, sometimes from 5:30 in the morning to 8 p.m., with a total of 40 minutes of breaks for meals. There was some improvement. Factory workers earned more money than domestic workers, and before, people would eat very little meat. It was a luxury, but now everybody ate meat. What was different was public awareness. Everybody knew that things were bad and something should be done. Capitalism, until then, was the accepted philosophy. Supply and demand dictated the market. Economist Professor Adam Smith believed in few restrictions on trade, such as tariffs. Thomas Malthus believed that overpopulation was the problem. And economist David Ricardo believed that wages should remain low, that the poor should remain poor. They shouldn't get a lot of money. You don't raise salaries because then laborers would compete against each other, and that's bad. Also, if laborers did too well, they would have more children, and that is also bad. Well, while all these intellectuals dazzled the world with all their mumbo-jumbo, the working class kept on working. In his novel Hard Times, Charles Dickens wrote about towns of red brick tarnished with black smoke, of rivers with smelly dye, of steam engines and pistons and noise, and factories with monotonous day in and day out of the same work, day after day, year after year. Something had to give, and finally, politics got involved. Again, this began in England, where there were 2 major parties. The Whigs, who favored the industrialists, and the Tories, who favored the workers. Well, little by little, compromises were made because all these politicians needed votes. and changes, slowly but surely, were made. There was some improvement. Slavery had been abolished in England in 1833. The U.S. would follow after the Civil War. There were reform bills, expansion of the vote, revision of work laws, legalized labor unions, tariffs were lowered. In 1842, the 10-Hour Act passed, limiting the workday to 10 hours. That same year, women, girls, and young boys were not allowed to work in the coal mines. Philosopher Jeremy Bentham popularized the saying that the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Yet some wanted faster change, and along came the rise of socialism, the proposal that management and control of production should be in the hands of the workers. The French noble Count Henri de Saint-Simon was a utopian socialist. He believed that industry should benefit the masses and that each be paid according to his work, that technicians and managers supervise it all. François-Marie Charles Fourier believed in cooperatives, self-sufficient communities of 5,000 acres with 16 to 1,800 people working together. And then came Robert Owen, a very, very rich textile manufacturer. He had 2,000 employees in one city in Scotland alone. Now, Owens in 1800, on his own, created his own cooperative. He raised wages, built schools, built houses, limited the use of children, and crime and disease went down. Now, he was unsuccessful in other cities, but he started the Cooperative Movement. Now, usually when you have a well-intentioned cooperative, if they fail, it was due to bickering and disagreements among the inhabitants. And now we come to Karl Marx with what he calls scientific socialism. Marx was a lawyer and philosopher who left Germany because his radical views got him in trouble. In France, he met Friedrich Engels, and they became friends. In 1848, they published the Communist Manifesto, which emboldened Marx's thoughts and strategy for social revolution. He wrote 2 volumes of Das Kapital and was working on a third when he died. Engels completed the work. Well, what did Marx believe? Marx believed that capitalism was doomed. He believed that the proletariat, that is, the labor workers, would seize control from the bourgeois, the middle class. Marx believed that economic factors and class determined society's character. And as capitalism replaced feudalism in the past, so socialism would one day replace capitalism. And with a classless society, there would be no class struggle. He had what he called an analysis of value. For example, if a piano required 1,000 man-hours of labor and each labor worker was paid $1 an hour, the piano is worth $1,000. If you sell it for $2,000, well, instead of the manufacturer getting $1,000 in profit, Marx argued that those $1,000 should go to the workers. He stated that overpopulation brought overproduction, which means oversupply, loss of work, and collapse. And with this collapse, depression would come, and that would begin the end of capitalism. He stated that this was going to happen, that it was inevitable. Well, since Marx died in 1883, we can safely say that he was wrong. There were many fallacies in Marx's arguments. Going back to that piano, he talked about labor costs, but he did not take into account parts, resources, a place to make the piano, taking orders, advertising, packaging, creating demand, accounting, transportation, electricity, machine maintenance. Workers do not supply any of these things. Only the manufacturer does. Marx didn't take into account the changes that were coming. By the end of the 19th century, there was increase in political participation of the masses. There were trade unions, new regulations, and conditions had improved. He also placed too much importance to class. People are more than just their economic status. Religion, nationalism, upbringing, geography, family structure, all of this plays a part in molding an individual. And as for the idealistic working man's dream, I'm always reminded of the movie Reds, where playwright Eugene O'Neill, played by Jack Nicholson, comments on the working man's dream by saying that the working man's dream is to have enough money not to have to work. Karl Marx would have been a footnote in history if it wasn't for the Russian Revolution of 1917, when a group of Marxists took over. After Russia adopted the socialist trend, other countries followed, 193 in all. And as country after country fell under the communist influence, we have to talk about the term democide. Democide is the intentional killing of an unarmed person by government agents pursuant to government policy or high command. In other words, if you protest your government, you are killed. This was done through forced labor, mass killings, gulags, concentration camps, and so on. So how many have died in 100 years of communist democide? Nobody really knows, but some say it could be as high as 110 million. Nevertheless, countries began turning away from communism. By the mid-1980s, there were only 5 communist countries: China, North Korea, Cuba, Laos, and Vietnam. Now, in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th, the United States had 3 progressive presidents: Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. Now, Roosevelt was the most active. After he read Upton Sinclair's The Jungle, where he found out about the horrible conditions of the meat industry, Roosevelt established the Food and Drug Administration. He also busted up monopolies and had millions and millions of acres of land turned into national parks and wildlife reserves. Now, these movements worldwide had a lot to do with the extension of the vote, even though American women would not get the vote until 1920. But as democracy took the place of monarchies and as politicians needed support of the working class, laws and reforms took place. Public health improved. The conditions of poor mothers improved. There were better working conditions, better wages, assistance to the elderly. The standard of living slowly improved, and medical advances reduced the death rate, and labor unions were given recognition. But going back to the 1900s, the early 1900s, there were still extremists. An anarchist, Luigi Galliani, an Italian, proposed violence and bombings against oppressors in the United States. He was deported back to Italy in 1919. But a year later, his followers carried out the bombings of Wall Street in New York City, where 30 died and hundreds were injured. Now, 2 of his followers, 2 fans, would become infamous. In April 1920 in New York City, Nicolás Sacco, a shoemaker, and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, a fish peddler, were arrested for armed robbery and for murdering a guard. They were tried and sentenced to death. Now, many conclude that the trial was a sham, that anti-Italian and anti-immigration played a part. Protests took place around the world, yet they were executed in 1927. Were they guilty? Well, I guess we don't know, but if you're friends with Luigi Galliani, well, you don't get a lot of sympathy. One very famous American communist was John Reed, who led movements within the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which had ties to socialism. Now, that union began in 1905 and by 1917 had 150,000 members. Today, it has less than 6,000. John Reed wrote about and witnessed the Russian Revolution. He died in 1920 of typhus, and he is buried in Russia today. Charlie Chaplin of England made millions laugh at his movie character, the Little Tramp. He was adored by millions. However, in his films such as The Great Dictator and Modern Times, he criticizes automation, assembly line tactics, low wages, and the rich began to see him as too radical. In 1952, he visited England, and while he was there, he learned that his United States re-entry permit had been revoked. Years later, he would be forgiven, and he came to the United States to pick up an honorary Oscar in 1972. Now, many protests can take different forms and evolve. Anti-slavery plight of the African Americans in the 1800s, well, it would give way to the civil rights movements of the 1900s. And as for women such as Susan B. Anthony looking for suffrage, the right to vote, this would give way to modern-day feminism. Labor movements would continue. They would evolve and they would branch out, such as the movement of migrant workers under Cesar Chavez. Harvey Milk's gay rights activism would lead to today's LGBT movement. The decades-old environmental movement has taken greater urgency today. And the movements to stop the exploitation of children still continues today. There are millions of children worldwide victims to child labor, living in extreme poverty, and also victims of sexual abuse and sex trafficking. So movements will continue, but what's next for this series of the history of the world? We're going to go back to the late 19th century, but we will examine the triumph of imperialism, and after that, World War I. In the meantime, send me your comments, or better yet, subscribe. This is Cool Talk.